Somewhere in your yard right now sits a corner the exact size of a single parking space you've never once considered farmland. Here's a claim that sounds completely wrong until you actually check the numbers behind it. That corner, worked correctly, can genuinely outproduce a full quarter-acre of traditional row garden. This is not a rough guess or a marketing exaggeration dressed up for a video title. It is a documented method built by one retired engineer who got fed up with his community garden. 4 techniques, most of them nearly a century old, stack directly on top of each other in that same tiny square. This video breaks down exactly how, with the real research behind every single number involved. It also explains why almost nobody grows food this way anymore, even though none of it was ever truly lost. His name was Mel Bartholomew, and before gardening made him known, he spent his career as a civil engineer. That is exactly the kind of person trained to look at a system and immediately spot where waste hides. When he retired in the mid-1970s, he did what plenty of newly retired people do. He joined a community garden. It should have been relaxing, and instead it drove him a little bit crazy almost immediately. Every plot on that lot got planted the exact same way. Long straight rows with wide aisles in between. More than half the ground on each plot was given over to paths people walked rather than soil that grew anything. He asked around, plot by plot, why everyone gardened this particular way, and nobody had a real answer. It was simply what a farm looked like, scaled down awkwardly to fit inside a backyard. Nobody had stopped to ask whether that farm logic even made sense without a tractor anywhere nearby. So Bartholomew did exactly what an engineer does when a system clearly does not add up correctly. He went home and redesigned the entire problem from scratch, using his own garden as the test case. Over roughly 2 years of trial and error, he landed on a plot exactly 12 feet by 12 feet. That plot split into 9 raised beds, each one measuring 4 feet by 4 feet across. Every single bed then subdivided again into 16 individual 1-foot squares using simple string or scrap wood. 1 crop went into each square, spaced according to that plant's actual mature size, rather than tractor width. He called this approach square-foot gardening, and published a book under that exact name back in 1981. An updated edition followed decades later, alongside a companion television series on public broadcasting. That book eventually sold close to 1 million copies, which is a strange kind of proof all on its own. A method does not get bought by nearly 1 million households simply because it sounds appealing in a magazine. It gets bought and rebought because people who tried it told their neighbors it genuinely worked. The number that really made it stick was never the yield alone. It was the ratio behind that yield. Square-foot gardening is commonly credited with cutting required growing space by roughly 80%. It also reduced water needed to reach that same harvest by somewhere near 90% overall. Read that carefully, because it is easy to skim right past what it actually means in practice. That is not 80% more food from the same space. It is roughly 80% less space for the same food. That is not a marginal efficiency tweak anyone would expect from simply rearranging a garden bed. That is a fundamentally different category of growing entirely, traced back to one 12 by 12 corner. It exists because one annoyed engineer refused to accept tradition as an actual answer to a reasonable question. It is worth pausing on how unglamorous that origin story genuinely is before moving any further. It is easy to assume a method this influential came from a university lab or a government program somewhere. It did not. It came from one frustrated retiree with a tape measure, a notebook, and 2 years of patience. That 12 by 12 plot is the anchor for this entire video, both literally and as proof of concept. Everything from here forward assumes a corner roughly that same size, something most yards can find somewhere. What follows is what happens when a modern grower does not stop at Bartholomew's spacing trick alone. Instead, 3 more forgotten, independently documented techniques get stacked directly on top of it. Here is the part that rarely gets said clearly enough in most gardening content available today. Intensive small space growing is not some brand new invention finally arriving to rescue modern gardeners. It is old, thoroughly tested knowledge that most households simply stopped needing at some point. There is a real difference between a skill dying because it failed and one fading because its problem disappeared. Go back further than Bartholomew. to French market gardeners working small walled plots outside Paris in the 1800s. They fed entire neighborhoods off land small enough to walk across in under a single minute. That intensive method crossed the Atlantic in the late 1960s through an Englishman named Alan Chadwick. He taught it at a student garden project at a California university, blending in biodynamic farming ideas. For most of human history, a small household yard needed to produce something edible to matter at all. Groceries were never a 15-minute drive away, stocked year-round regardless of the actual season outside. Then, the second half of the 20th century arrived, and two forces converged almost simultaneously. Land got cheap and plentiful enough after the post-war suburban boom that lawns became the default backyard use. A patch of grass got mowed and maintained rather than harvested from week after week like it once was. The supermarket supply chain got efficient enough, fast enough, that growing your own food became optional. It quietly turned into a hobby many time-strapped families simply did not prioritize anymore. The skill of intensive growing never disappeared because it stopped working in any meaningful way. It faded from daily use because the underlying need for it disappeared first for most wealthier households. There is a generational piece worth naming directly, since it explains why this can feel newly discovered. A skill not actively passed down for 2 or 3 generations does not just fade quietly into the background. It gets actively replaced in the popular imagination by whatever style of gardening came right after it. Ask most people today to picture gardening, and they will picture straight rows with wide aisles between them. That is the exact layout Bartholomew spent 2 years dismantling simply because it dominated during his lifetime. Rising grocery prices, renewed interest in knowing where food actually comes from, and underused backyards. All of that has pulled these old techniques back into active use over the past couple of decades. The knowledge itself never actually left. It sat published and freely available the entire time. It was mostly the people using it day to day who quietly disappeared from view over those decades. 4 techniques. 1 plot. This is exactly where the real payoff of this whole idea genuinely lives. None of these 4 ideas were developed together by the same person in the same decade or even coast. They come from an engineer in New York, a researcher in Northern California, and cold climate university programs. They also come from indigenous agricultural traditions predating all 3 of those sources by centuries. What makes this different from simply listing 4 gardening tips is how these techniques interlock almost perfectly. Bartholomew's spacing trick is the foundation. Everything else in this stack gets built directly on top of. Used entirely on its own, though, it gets you efficient results, not truly extraordinary ones. What actually closes the gap with a 1/4 acre comes from stacking 3 more layers on that same footprint. Each layer compounds the others, rather than simply adding to them in a flat, linear way. First technique, deep soil preparation, tackling the exact same underlying problem far more aggressively. While Bartholomew worked out his spacing grid on the East Coast, another researcher attacked soil directly. His name is John Jeavons, running a research and teaching organization called Ecology Action since the early 1970s. Jeavons did not stop at rearranging where plants sit on the surface of a garden bed at all. He went straight after the dirt itself, developing what he calls the grow biointensive method. That method centers on double-digging garden beds, down roughly 2 feet, far past typical garden depth. This gives plant roots genuine room that a conventional garden simply never offers them at all. The published research behind this claim is specific enough to be independently checked rather than taken on faith. Ecology Action's own published numbers put biointensive yields between 2 and 6 times conventional row methods. That comes while simultaneously using between 50 and 75% less land to achieve it. In some documented cases, water use dropped by as much as roughly 88% as well. In one interview, Jeavons stated that as little as 100 square feet of properly prepared bed works. A grower can realistically raise several $100s worth of vegetables and soft fruit across one season. 100 square feet is smaller than a typical 1-car garage, and smaller than this whole 12 by 12 footprint. The mechanism behind those numbers is almost boring once genuinely understood, which is a sign it is real. loosen soil deep enough, and plant roots stop competing sideways for the same shallow, compacted band of nutrients. Roots go down instead of sprawling outward across the surface, competing with every neighboring plant. That single shift lets growers plant noticeably closer together than a conventional row garden ever safely could. The real competition for resources happens in a vertical dimension most backyard gardeners never think to prepare. Second technique, building vertically. Once soil beneath the surface does more work per square foot than ever. Vertical gardening means training vining and climbing crops up trellises instead of letting them sprawl. This has been formally studied by university agricultural extension programs, and the resulting numbers are not subtle. Research summarized from cooperative extension work on small space food production found striking results. Vertical growing methods can increase yield per square foot by 3 to 5 times over conventional row planting. That happens while occupying the exact same amount of actual ground space as before. Think through what that actually means once it sits inside a 12 by 12 corner like this one. A single 6-foot A-frame trellis occupies roughly 4 feet of ground space at its base. Once both sloped sides of the frame get counted, it offers close to 50 square feet of growing surface. That essentially borrows most of a second garden's worth of growing area and hangs it in the air. No extra yard space gets used to make room for that additional growing surface at all. Pole beans, cucumbers, indeterminate tomato varieties, and smaller melons all take to vertical training well. Most of these are crops home gardeners already grow, simply redirected upward instead of left sprawling. There is also a quieter benefit here that does not show up cleanly in the yield percentages themselves. Lifting foliage off bare soil dramatically cuts down on soil-borne fungal disease that ruins backyard harvests. Air finally circulates freely around leaves instead of getting trapped against damp ground below them. Third technique, companion planting the old way, predating both researchers already covered by thousands of years. It comes directly from indigenous agricultural knowledge developed long before European contact reached North America. Growing corn, beans, and squash together in the same mound is most closely associated with the Haudenosaunee. Closely related versions were independently developed and adapted by numerous other indigenous nations as well. Each nation fit the core idea to their own local climate and soil conditions over generations. The underlying mechanics are elegant enough that modern agricultural science essentially confirmed rather than improved them. Corn grows a tall, sturdy stalk that functions as a living trellis for climbing beans planted right beside it. That quietly handles part of the structural job that the second technique otherwise pays lumber and wire to do. Beans in turn host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their root nodules, pulling nitrogen straight from the air. That nitrogen deposits into the soil, feeding the heavy-feeding corn, planted right next to them at no cost. Squash spreads low and wide across open ground between the 2 other crops in the mound. Its broad leaves shade out competing weeds and slow moisture evaporation from the exposed soil surface. That does the same job a bag of purchased mulch would otherwise be handling on its own. 3 plants, 3 distinct functional jobs, each one quietly covering a cost the other 2 would otherwise absorb. This is documented, functional companion planting that indigenous communities relied on for genuine food security. It drops directly into a 12 by 12 intensive bed without requiring any additional ground space at all. Fourth technique, stealing weeks from winter, and this one is not about space at all. It is about time. It is the technique people most consistently skip, mostly because it sounds harder than it actually is. A cold frame at its simplest is a bottomless box with a clear hinged lid built low to the ground. It traps solar heat during daylight hours and holds onto a portion of that heat through the following night. University extension programs across multiple cold climate states have measured this consistently over decades. A basic cold frame typically extends the usable growing season by 2 to 6 weeks on each end of the calendar. It can keep its interior running anywhere from 5 to 15 degrees warmer than outside air on a clear day. One can be built from a salvaged old window sash and scrap lumber in a single afternoon for well under $50. In many cases, the cost drops close to nothing if the materials come entirely from reclaimed scrap. What that modest investment actually buys is not just a handful of extra lettuce harvests tacked onto the year. It buys more full growing cycles stacked into the exact same 12 by 12 footprint across a calendar year. A bed that would otherwise sit bare from the first hard frost through the last one stays quietly productive. It keeps producing cool season greens through weeks. Most conventional gardens have already surrendered to winter. This is the technique that ultimately turns the other three from a strong single-season yield into a compounding one. Every additional planting cycle squeezed into a single year is functionally free square footage never used elsewhere. Putting the stack together, none of these four techniques is rare information locked away behind any paywall. Bartholomew's spacing grid is documented in a book that has sold close to 1 million copies over 4 decades. Cold frame plans sit freely on university extension websites right now, available to anyone with internet access. Companion planting has been demonstrated and taught by indigenous communities for centuries across the continent. It is now standard, respected material inside agricultural extension programs across the entire country. What is actually rare is not access to the knowledge itself sitting freely available for anyone to find. It is the willingness to stack all 4 techniques together instead of picking just one and calling it finished. A grower who deep preps soil, builds vertical structure, companion plants correctly, and extends the calendar wins. That grower is not running 4 separate hobbies in parallel across the same small plot of ground. They are compounding 4 independently documented multipliers on the exact same 12 by 12 corner. That compounding effect is the honest engine behind the quarter-acre comparison running through this entire video. It is worth being precise about what that comparison actually means, rather than letting it float unexamined. It is a framing researchers and experienced intensive growers use to illustrate what stacked techniques achieve. It gets compared against a sparsely planted, traditional row and aisle plot, planted the old-fashioned way. It is not a guaranteed formula where each multiplier stacks cleanly on top of the last in perfect arithmetic. Actual results in any given yard depend heavily on soil, sun exposure, climate, and consistent weekly attention. But the direction of that comparison, a small intensive plot closing the gap with a much larger one, holds up. That is exactly what research from Ecology Action and multiple university extension programs keeps independently confirming. The footprint, none of this requires acreage, and that is the entire point of building around one small corner. A dozen raised bedboards, some hardware cloth if rabbits or groundhogs are a problem locally. A couple of simple trellis panels and one cold frame built from a salvaged window covers the entire physical footprint. This could fit along a fence line, in a narrow strip beside a driveway, or against a sunny garage wall. It also fits across the sunniest quarter of an ordinary suburban backyard without touching the rest of the lawn. No tractor, no tiller in most cases, and no permit needed since raised beds fall outside typical zoning rules. Just one corner that gets decent, consistent sun, and a genuine willingness to prepare that soil properly once. Materials realistically run somewhere between $100 and $300 for a first build attempt. Raised bed frames, a handful of trellis panels, an old storm window, and enough compost to fill 9 beds. None of it needs to be purchased new, and most experienced growers build their first plot from second-hand material. Now, for an honest catch, every method covered here comes with a real cost attached to it somewhere. That cost is not money. It is labor and patience concentrated into a small space instead of spread thin. That is a fundamentally different rhythm than most casual weekend gardeners are genuinely used to experiencing. Double digging a bed 2 feet down by hand is genuinely hard physical work the very first time it happens. It is not a quick weekend chore squeezed in before lunch. It is closer to a standalone weekend project. Skipping that step entirely, or doing it only halfway to save time, is the most common reason yields underperform. Soil preparation is where the bulk of actual yield originates from within this entire stacked system. Shortcut it, and everything built on top. The trellises, the companion planting, stands on a weaker foundation. There is also a real learning curve with companion planting that catches many first-time growers off guard. Corn, beans, and squash need to go into the ground in roughly the correct order and specific timing. Corn gets planted first to get a genuine head start on height before beans get introduced beside it. Get that sequencing wrong in a first season, which is common, and the result becomes a tangled mess instead. That is a completely fixable mistake once understood, but nearly every first-time grower makes it at least once. A cold frame, despite its low material cost, genuinely needs daily attention on sunny days, not occasional check-ins. Left closed under direct, strong sunlight, the sealed interior can overheat and cook everything growing inside quickly. It needs venting open as temperatures rise each morning and closing again as they drop each evening. That means it functions as a small daily commitment for the entire stretch it stays in active use. There is also a timeline worth being honest about, since none of these techniques deliver full numbers immediately. Deep dug soil needs a season or two of added organic matter to really hit its published stride. A first-year trellis planting is still teaching which crops in a specific climate actually want to climb. Companion planting almost always needs one full season of trial and error before spacing and timing click properly. Realistically, this stacked plot needs year 2 or 3 before performing anywhere near its documented ceiling. Any version of this that implied instant full results on day 1 would genuinely be doing a disservice. Climate is the last honest variable worth naming, since it depends entirely on where the actual garden sits. Cold frame figures cited come from extension programs in genuinely cold winter states specifically. A season extension in a harsh northern climate will look different from the same technique applied somewhere milder. Vertical gardening multipliers assume decent sun exposure across a full season, which a shaded lot might lack. Actual results in any given yard are the only figures that ultimately matter for that specific grower. None of this is a reason to skip the method altogether. It is a reason to understand the trade being made. This is a labor trade, not a money trade, running through every part of this entire system. Nobody is buying their way to a bigger harvest here with better tools or a bigger budget somewhere. Deliberate, concentrated effort goes into a small footprint instead of spreading thin effort across a much larger one. That is a meaningfully different rhythm than most people expect walking into their very first growing season. Who this actually suits, and the real payoff, this is not really a video about becoming a market farmer overnight. Though honest surplus from a well-run 12 by 12 plot can absolutely end up at a farmer's market table. It could also land on a small neighborhood produce stand, or in an informal box shared among neighbors. The more immediate, far more universal payoff is simpler than any of that market farming possibility. It comes down to what one corner does to an ordinary household grocery bill across a full year. Run the actual figures, several $100s of produce from as little as 100 square feet in a season. Stack 3 additional documented multipliers on top of that baseline soil method inside a larger footprint. That produces a meaningful, genuinely measurable offset against what an average household spends at the grocery store. This works particularly well for a specific kind of household, worth naming honestly, rather than pretending universal fit. It suits someone with a small, underused, sunny corner, rather than acres of open land to spare. It suits someone with more spare time on evenings and weekends than spare money for a grocery budget. The entire trade here is effort for output rather than cash for output, which suits a specific lifestyle. It also suits someone willing to treat the first season as a genuine learning year, rather than expecting instant results. This stack takes a season or two to really hit its stride, as already covered honestly above. The real insight worth carrying away is what these 4 techniques do, once treated as one connected system. That is the same fundamental reframe that made Bartholomew's original 12 by 12 plot so much more valuable. Deep soil feeds vigorous vertical growth reaching upward instead of sprawling across limited ground space. Vertical growth frees up ground space underneath it for companion planting to happen simultaneously below. Companion planting quietly builds soil fertility for free, feeding next season's deep bed preparation in turn. A cold frame simply buys more full turns of that entire cycle inside a single calendar year than otherwise possible. That is the very same compounding logic behind the original Three Sisters mound centuries before it had a formal name. There is also a less quantifiable payoff sitting underneath the grocery bill math worth naming before finishing here. A 12 by 12 plot, running all 4 techniques together, produces more food than it visually appears capable of. It produces on a schedule controlled directly, rather than one dictated entirely by a supply chain nobody sees inside. When a cold frame holds cool season greens through weeks, the rest of the neighborhood has already gone dormant. That is the actual argument sitting behind this comparison once the punchy framing gets stripped away entirely. It is not that 4 clever tricks magically multiply a tiny plot's output into a literal quarter acre on paper. It is that 4 well-documented, independently researched techniques, deliberately stacked, close a gap that looks impossible. A conventional quarter acre planted the old row and aisle way is mostly empty walking space and half-used season. A 12 by 12 corner that wastes almost nothing and sits idle for almost none of the calendar year wins out. It is quietly playing an entirely different game, on a fraction of the ground most gardens actually use. No farm is needed anywhere to test any part of this entire approach starting this very season. One sunny corner already sitting unused somewhere on most properties is genuinely all this method requires. Get one full season of that right, and watch closely what a properly prepared bed actually produces. Compare that honestly against what was originally expected going into that first full season of growing. Then layer in the next technique only once the first one has proven itself out in that specific yard. The barrier here was never land, and it genuinely never really was, in any meaningful sense at all. A retired civil engineer proved that with 9 small boxes and a bag of vermiculite roughly 50 years ago. Researchers working quietly for decades since have methodically proven how much further that same idea can be pushed. What is actually rare in all of this is not the growing space sitting unused in most yards right now. It is finding someone willing to prepare a small corner properly instead of a large corner carelessly. So here is a genuine question worth sitting with honestly while looking out at your own yard right now. Is there a 12 by 12 corner out there, doing nothing more than growing grass that gets mowed weekly anyway? Drop that answer in the comments below, sun exposure and all, and it will get read carefully. A reply will follow with exactly which of these 4 techniques makes the most sense to start with first.